Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. I want to thank everyone who is in person today and also our audience online. Before we start with our first panel of the day, about 4 decades of democracy in Latin America, chaired by Benjamin Garcia-Holgado at the University of Delaware, I would like to make just a couple of announcements for today. The first one is that we will have a slight change in our schedule because Secretary General Luis Almagro needs to leave today early to return to Washington, D.C. So today we will have our last panel of the day. We will stop that panel a little bit early, a few minutes earlier, and then Secretary Almagro will say a few words here and not at dinner. We will still have our dinner, but he will say a few words in this room before he leaves, rather than speaking at dinner. So that's the first change in our schedule. And then something I wanted to mention is that Frank Langfitt from NPR is here. You met him yesterday, and he would like to say a few words to you. Thank you. Frank.
Yes, thanks very much for having me here, and I'm really glad that Notre Dame and the Kellogg School is doing this because this is such a huge issue, and it's great for me as a journalist to be in a room with so many people who are doing so much interesting research. And one of the reasons I came here actually is looking for potential story ideas on threats to democracy. My portfolio is threats to democracy at home and abroad, which could keep me busy for quite a few years. But what I'd love to talk to people about during the breaks, if you're available and interested, is there particular research you're doing that really is not understood in the public realm, where you feel you're making real headway, you're really exposing things that's going on? Particularly, I'm interested in investigative stories that expose bad actors, what they're doing, and also in a comparative sense, because we always talk about this authoritarian playbook, but I think it's very valuable for our audiences online, on the radio, and elsewhere to see exactly how that works and how common some of the methods are in different parts of the world. So thank you very much, and I'd love to talk to any of you who have any research to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And on that note, Benjamin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Benjamin Garcia-Holgado. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Delaware. Until 10:30, I will be the chair of the panel State of the World, 4 Decades of Democracy in Latin America. And thank you, Aníbal and the Kellogg Institute, for inviting me to do this. It's great to be back here. And we are very lucky to have 3 very distinguished panelists to discuss the current state of Latin American democracies. Scott Mainwaring is professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Wendy is professor of political science at the University of Texas, Austin. And Francisco Guerrero is secretary for strengthening democracy at the Organization of American States. I will ask the panelists a couple of questions for an hour, and then we will have 30 minutes for your questions in the audience. So thank you, and thank you for being here too. So the first question I wanted to ask you is descriptive, and it's about the current situation of Latin American democracies. What is the current trajectory of democracy in Latin America? So you want to start, Scott, and we go in order from my...
Sure. Well, I mean, I think at the outset, I will say that, before the third wave of democratization began, the region had oscillated between democracy and authoritarianism. When I started graduate school in 1978, out of 20 countries in the region, there were 2 democracies, 1 semi-democracy, and 17 authoritarian regimes. So the situation over the last 2 generations has improved greatly. However, if we take a shorter time period, let's say this century, now 25 years, the dominant pattern is stagnation at levels of democracy that are pretty deficient. And where the changes have occurred, since with the exception of Peru's re-democratization in 2001, all of the other changes in this century, there aren't a whole lot of profound changes, but they're all negative. So this is the transition in Venezuela from liberal democracy to competitive authoritarianism, and then to very brutal repressive authoritarianism. It is the transition in Nicaragua from semi-democracy to very brutal authoritarianism, and the decay, a modest decay, but detected by both VDEM and Freedom House, of democracy in Mexico. Criminal organizations have been a big player in that decay, and some decay in Brazil as well. I think the other place that, it was never democratic or anywhere close to democratic, but the other place where there has been a change, I would say, is Haiti, and the change there is really state collapse. I mean, those are the two sides of this picture, right? The region is still far more democratic than it was in most of its history, but the situation, if we're taking the trajectory of the last 20 or 25 years, I think is mostly negative. It's not steeply negative, but there's not a single case of significant democratic deepening in this century, again, possibly excluding the Peruvian case, not that Peru is a deep democracy, but Peru did transition back to democracy in 2001. So that's my quick take.
Okay. Wendy?
Basically filling in the gaps for what Scott said, although I agree with him for the most part. Let me just highlight a couple of cases. I think the Salvadoran case is very problematic, especially since many other countries are looking to it as a model, even though, as we'll say later, anyone who knows about how you fight criminal organizations would say that the Salvadoran model of a crackdown and massive imprisonment is probably not going to be followed, where gangs are very different, more internationalized, less focused on extortion, much more embedded with the political class and international networks. Nonetheless, El Salvador, I think, is a particularly problematic case. I do want to later highlight, though, that I think there have been some successes. Guatemala is sitting right next to El Salvador. And after a series of shady characters, they elected, and he remains standing, Bernardo Arevalo. And crime from drugs and such is down in that country. So I think there are some bright spots that I also want to talk about. Haiti, though, is just a case of state collapse, and that will even affect rule of law in the Dominican Republic, with the incredible push, an understandable push, to go from Haiti to the DR.
Thank you very much. Just a quick thanks to Aníbal, to Alejandro González, Andrés. Thank you for having me. It's been a big journey getting here because I was in the Dominican Republic 2 days ago. And I share in principle all the things that you have mentioned. But explaining myself from the ground, being an international observer and being in charge of international observation but for the OAS, I would like to say that there are a few things that have to be considered in the analysis. First of all, the impact of the pandemic on democracy. What it means to have pandemic in a democracy. During the pandemic period, I had the chance to travel to 20 missions. We carried out 20 missions, which were extremely interesting. I would recommend, that's something that I've been talking to Aníbal and Alejandro on the fact of researching a little bit more about the reports that we produce in those elections. If you have a look to those elections, you're gonna see that there's one very good news and perhaps not so many good news on the other side. The good news is that despite all the problems that we're facing, people are still believing that having an election is worth it. And I think that's something that perhaps sounds very simple, but let me tell you from my experience, is very emotional in a way. The second thing that I can see is the impact of inequality. I think poverty is growing in many countries. The pandemic sent us back to 2007 in terms of the goals that we had. And in that sense, I would agree also with three countries who are much worse than they were 10 years ago, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, and the fact that Nicaragua and Venezuela left the organization, left the OAS, because of so many other issues, I think is important. The case of Haiti, this is something that we're discussing as we speak. Last week we had a visit of the Venice Commission to the OAS, and we're trying to figure out a way in carrying out elections in that country. But a bit of a joke, when the representatives of the OAS asked me, how much do you need to have elections in Haiti? I say thousands of dollars, thousands of millions of dollars. I say, why? Because you need a police, you need to reestablish the whole thing. So I think that's complicated. Just to finish the case of Guatemala, I think that the case of Guatemala gives us hope. And gives us hope because it's the first time that I've seen in many, many years, at least 9 years that I've been at the Permanent Council, in which all the countries, from the center, the right, the left, they agreed on principle that elections should be respected. And Mr. Arevalo, this was a process that lasted for 6 months. We had to organize 2 special missions, the electoral observation mission and then a mission to accompany the democratic process in Guatemala. Of course, that doesn't mean that things are great or that things are going to improve necessarily, not necessarily, but at least I would summarize it like this. We're having elections, and having elections at least is something that we should be celebrating, I think.
Well, thank you very much. And now that we have a general overview of the current situation, I would like to ask you what are the most pressing threats to democracy these days? Scott mentioned Wendy too, criminal violence, but I would like to go in more detail on current threats and how do you think these threats vary across different countries in the region?
Yeah, thank you, Benka. So I think that criminal organizations, of course, are a very profound threat to democracy for at least 2 different reasons. One is that they directly violate rights. In some places they govern. In many places they've corrupted the judiciary, the police, and the people who are formally elected to office. In these places, there is no democracy, or democracy is severely impaired in a best-case scenario. The other reason is what we could call the Bukele scenario, in which public security is so terrible that citizens willingly trade off support for a very authoritarian leader in order to gain in terms of public security. So I think that's very clearly a huge threat. We could add to that in a lot of places, paramilitaries have organized in response to criminal organizations. I've read that something like 60% of the population of Greater Rio de Janeiro is governed by paramilitary forces. And then finally, also on this topic, right, in a lot of countries, including very prominently Mexico and El Salvador, the response to deep threats to public security has been massive state violations of rights. So that's clearly a very prominent threat. Second, I think that the very poor governance results that most of the region has seen since the end of the great commodity boom, exacerbated by the pandemic, clearly, it's understandable that citizens turn to different kinds of solutions if Democrats continuously fail. So, I mean, these results, the governance results, vary widely across countries. To briefly answer address the question about how things vary across countries. But generally, with relatively few exceptions, the results for the last dozen years or more have been pretty poor. If you take a longer time frame, you could say that there's been a lot of social incorporation, but over the last 12 years, I think the results in terms of poverty, inequality have gone backwards, probably in more countries than they've gone forward. Third, this is in no particular order, but where illiberal executives win office, especially in contexts of weak institutions, watch out. I mean, especially in this context of poor prior governance results and public security threats. Institutions in most of Latin America are not strong enough to contain illiberal executives, at least all the time. And then fourth, and I don't intend this at all flippantly, but I think that if Donald Trump wins in November, that will represent new opportunities for authoritarians in Latin America. To return to the, I think, very important example of Bernardo Arévalo, I don't think that he would have taken office if Trump had been president. It took a lot of pressure from the US to ensure that Arévalo took office. And I think that other authoritarian gambits they would have a better chance to succeed in a context in which the US doesn't prioritize democracy, but instead prioritizes friendliness to the US president, or, for example, also restrictive immigration policies. To give an example, that I don't think that Jair Bolsonaro would probably have succeeded at his coup attempt if Trump had been in office, but I think the probability would have increased from essentially 0% to, I don't know what to say, but maybe 20%, 25%. So I just think that, without the US standing up for democracy, and in some cases with Trump in office, building close alliances with right-wing authoritarians, I think that is a threat to democracy in Latin America. I have no doubt about it.
So in this section, let me highlight the security issue as a threat that is highly problematic. So Latin America has 8% of the global population and nearly half of intentional homicides. It is the single most violent region in the world that is not in a civil war, that doesn't have civil wars active now. So this is problematic. The polls suggest it's problematic. Most Latin Americans rate criminality and corruption as two big problems, in many cases above economic issues. So if you look at most elections that lead to right-wing populists, really nearly all, they are all preceded by massive security issues that people recognize as problematic. El Salvador had the single highest rate of murders preceding Bukele and his crackdown. This not only led to very high approval and a stunning re-election, but a Congress that is full of Bukele supporters and a purge of the judiciary. There is no way you can explain this without taking out the public security issue. In Ecuador, the homicide rate has tripled in recent years. In a recent referendum run by Noboa, he won on every security issue. They were doing much of this anyway, putting the military in charge of criminality, but this just gives him free rein to intensify the role of the military and police in fighting criminal organizations. So let me highlight something that I think many of you may not know about. I find it interesting. In Brazil, there has been a recent phenomena of retired and active duty military and police officers running for elective office. And we saw a 27% increase in such candidates, so mayoral candidates and congressional deputy candidates, in the 2018 election that elected Bolsonaro, who himself came from the military. So not only do these people with this background quietly run, they call themselves by their military position, like Coronel Salema, Major Denise. They're doing this clearly to highlight their law and order side. A person who may become the next president of Brazil, or president at some point, Tarcísio Freitas, who is now governor of São Paulo, he comes from the military. He went to military academy. He then has a graduate degree from the military engineering school. This no doubt lurks in the background and may actually come to the foreground when he campaigns for political office. So this is within the rule of law, but it clearly suggests that this is on people's minds, and politicians know that this is a winner. I fear that Chile, which is one of the crown jewels of democracy in Latin America, is Chileans are becoming increasingly nervous about immigration for sure, but the southern migration of criminal organizations. This can only put votes in the camp of Jose Antonio Cast, extreme right leader. There are apparently taxis in Santiago with Bukele's picture on the side. For this to infect a country like Chile means it is very serious. And then my final comment on crime and public insecurity is that it affects people of all classes. However, the people who cannot afford the private security to buffer themselves from this are poor people. So this ends up being an issue of inequality. If you can't send your kids to a fancy school in an armored personnel carrier, if your leisure cannot be a country club but a beach that is insecure, that is a real inequality issue. Now, it's interesting to me that the left has a fairly poor record on law enforcement because the people that most need this, in some sense, are poor people. And there is a real vicious cycle going on here. That the self-reinforcing dynamic is the upper class can seclude themselves and not be part of public institutions. We know that when that happens, public institutions deteriorate. And so in many ways, this is a form of inequality that I think we need to pay more attention to.
Well, I think they have already mentioned many of the things that I wanted to say. I would include, among other issues, the issue of toxic polarization. And when I refer to toxic polarization, I refer essentially to the debate that we're having in this apparatus, in this phone, and how it's creating very complicated conditions in the political campaigns. And I'm saying this because, to make it short, when you talk to people, and as you were speaking, I was trying to remember conversations with people in Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, or the Dominican Republic, just to refresh experiences that I just had in the last 6 months. And what you can see is that people are extremely fed up of the system. They are very tired of not getting results. The Democratic Charter, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, has two main issues. Elections, which, as I said, we are having elections. Good or bad that we're having elections. But the second part, that is the delivery in government, how government works. In that sense, I think that this toxic polarization created by X, created by TikTok particularly, in political campaigns, is driving people to vote for people to which you would never consider there could be a serious candidate in the past. And also some nostalgic views about what happened in the past. The recent case of Panama, I don't know if you followed the election in Panama. The former president Martinelli was in jail, by the way, at the Nicaraguan embassy, and Mulino, who was the candidate, the vice president, became the president because even if people were not very happy about that situation, that linkage, they felt, because of nostalgic reasons, that they could get something better that they haven't gotten in the last few years. So, of course, as it was mentioned, that drives us to populism and authoritarian regimes. And this, when people are so fed up of the system, what creates, in my view, is that the honeymoon, you remember in the good old days when the government came to power, they would say, it will have a honeymoon when I was a teenager, it was like 2 years, year and a half. Now there's no honeymoon. I mean, you go almost directly to divorce. You marry, you live a month, and then you're gonna get out of here, you know? So that's something that has to be considered, because in many countries, even if elections help to escape from this political pressure, the reality is that the quality of government and the way in which governments are being run is not particularly it doesn't create that much enthusiasm. Just to finish, I think you mentioned, Wendy, if you see all the polls almost in all the Latin American countries, the most popular political actor, they shouldn't be political, but they become political, are the church, first place, and the army. In some countries, that's okay, but in some other countries, that creates a lot of tension, because particularly the military is not supposed to be involved in politics, but it becomes involved because of the lack of results of, let's say, civilians.
Thank you. Although, I mean, some of you mentioned some of the causes of the deep discontent of many citizens in Latin America with political parties and democracy as a whole, but I would like you to go in a little bit more detail about the sources of this discontent, the potential risk, and especially what can we do to try to address this lack of trust, lack of enthusiasm with political parties and democracy.
Well, I have a very simple answer to that: govern better. That's, of course, I'm being funny when I say that, but I think that is the right answer, but then the question is, how do you govern better? And I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be rich and probably president of some place if I could give a completely a great answer to that question. I do think that just several thoughts. One is that state building, of course, is essential, and this is something that some of like Javier Milei, who I think he's right to reposition, that the Argentine state is overbearing, it crushes initiative, it creates many perverse incentives, but you cannot, right, the libertarian solution is never going to work, right? Someone said yesterday, I think it was yesterday, that you need some balance between enough and effective regulation, but not too much regulation, and that's true across the board. I think that was related to artificial intelligence, but that's true in almost every area of public life. One thing that I think that Democrats in the region have long neglected or paid insufficient attention to is democratic policing. The region desperately needs effective courts, effective legal systems, and effective police forces. Because the police have been so frequently associated with authoritarianism, I don't think that Democrats have effectively or sufficiently thought about how do we provide public security, but in democratic ways. When I say in democratic ways, I mean without egregiously violating rights. Gordon Brown, who was Prime Minister of the UK, once said, when it comes to the rule of law, the first 500 years are the most difficult, and I think that's right, but that's one of the great challenges for the region. How do you build effective states that at the same time aren't overweening states? One of the examples of, in terms of deep citizen discontent, which was part of your question, right? I think we've all said something about that. I don't think it's a mystery what the causes of deep discontent are. It's bad public security, public policies that are not generating better life opportunities for citizens. One one point that, of course, is essential is effective democratic leadership, right? I mean, if we don't have, if countries aren't electing good presidents, without good presidents, that's not all you need, but that is something that you desperately need in order to tackle these problems. And then just one thing I want to touch on briefly is international ways of addressing some of these problems. One of the most, I think, innovative attempts to address the severe problems of crime and impunity in Guatemala was the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which of course several years later was dismantled. And why was it dismantled? Because it was effective, right? Vested interests didn't want to end crime and impunity. But I think, you know, there are countries with committed Democrats in the presidency where something like that could be attempted. And that's especially important in a context of you know, the rising power of international criminal groups in almost every country in the region. Look at the three great cases of democracy in Latin America over the last 40 years, 34 years in the case of Chile, right? Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. If you look at the homicide rates in these three countries, they've risen dramatically in all three countries. This isn't because of some deficiencies in what's going on in these three countries with governments. It's because they face overwhelming challenges. Something, I think, I'm not an expert on this topic, but something, you know, we've got to think creatively about international efforts to tackle this problem more effectively.
So I want to pick up on your saying that govern effectively would be the answer. How do you do that? So I think it's important to realize that it's not like the people Latin American electorates are dying to support populists, and it is not even the case that Latin American militaries are dying to get into power. After the January 8th incident in Brazil, over 80% of all Brazilians said they disapproved of that act as a way to make trouble and supposedly get Bolsonaro back into power. If the math goes such that if 80% of people said that, a lot of those had to even be Bolsonaro supporters. So I think the default is democracy unless you blow it. So how do you not blow it? First of all, I think there needs to be more thought about how you deal with keeping the military out of power, because I think the default for the military is not to be in power. They are using this situation of public insecurity to get resources and to expand their roles, but short of governing. I think they need to stay out of drug interdiction and fighting criminality, because it's a slippery slope from there to taking over the courts, etc. How do you do that? You have to have better police. One reason the military are called upon to fight these battles is because there has not been sufficient police reform. And when you talk to people who know about police reform, they say you almost have to start over. You cannot use police already in the ranks and expect that they will change both their mentality and their tactics. This has to be new institution building. If you pick military commanders well, and this is in the hands of civilians, it is a hierarchical institution and people have to follow from there. So this is a great setup to get a better result. Now I know this next point will be controversial, but what we have seen is when you open the door to the past too strikingly, such as Dilma Rousseff did with revisiting the impunity of the Brazilian military, you get a backlash. The military saw this as a violation of the 1979 amnesty that exempted them from prosecution in exchange for exempting the youth that were kidnapping U.S. ambassadors and blowing up police stations. That is, to me, a real inflection point in the role expansion of the military thereafter. Michel Temer, who wasn't even Bolsonaro, was the first person to break with the 1909 Cardozo rule of civilians lead the Ministry of Defense. That happened right after Dilma and under Temer, and then it went south from there. So honor the military roles, keep them out of criminality enforcement, and pick the commanders well, which, by the way, I think Lula has done a very good job at. So the other thing is, it's not just that you have to keep problems down, okay? I think you need to build on the positive. And I want to underscore here that I think many Latin American countries have done a remarkable job at social policy. Social policy used to be the preserve of the church and of clientelist politicians who traded little goodies for votes. We now have welfare states with expanded coverage. It's not Sweden, it's not Norway, but rural people, indigenous people, people who do not work in the formal sector, now have formalized coverage for basic needs. This has come in the form of income transfers, non-contributory pensions, and basic health care. These things are not seen as benefits anymore, they are seen as rights. And there is much more minimal coverage for individuals than there used to be. Okay, again, not Sweden, but tremendous advancement on the 50 years before then. So how did this come about? I think democracy has been important in this transformation. Sanitary activists have gotten into the state, and these are technocrats who have done a good job. They mobilized during the end of military periods to get themselves in the state. People vote. Healthcare is an important thing. Income transfers are important. Politicians want their votes. So I think democracy has had a lot to do with this. There's been a remarkable decline in infant mortality in the last 30 years in Brazil. This is one of the most striking outcomes in the world. And it's even happened in countries that have not experienced tremendous growth and that do have unequal income distributions. It's harder to make inroads or declines the further down you get, but even countries in Latin America that are, have low rates of infant mortality, they too have managed to see declines in recent years. Brazil has had a 75% decline in infant mortality since 1990. Peru has had an 81% decline. This is not small. And so I think this is one of the accomplishments of democracy. This infant mortality has declined just about everywhere in the world except Venezuela, I note as a remarkable deviation from this. Collapsing healthcare system, they're not getting the under 5 vaccines out. The way infant mortality is the result of very targeted interventions, healthcare, vaccinations, access to clean water, drinking water, and nutrition. So if you want to make inroads on this, you can. It has happened remarkably in many countries in Latin America, more than Africa and Asia, but with the standout being Venezuela. And I think Venezuela's implosion has had a lot to do with this. Even the vaccines are not going out.
Well, I would agree with many things that have been said here. I would incorporate another issues that for me are relevant. You were asking about the sources of discontent and why we're in this situation. I think that something else has to be put on the table, and that's, I would call it political migration, or migration caused by the collapse of democracy. And the numbers are really, really horrible. In the last years, in the last 10 years, or perhaps even less than that, more than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. 7 million. That's a large number. For those of us who are Latin Americans and live in the US, you can see how things are changing in many traditional Mexican or Central American neighborhoods, and how this flood of Venezuelans is invading many other places. And the same happens with Nicaragua, the same happens with Cuba, and of course Haiti. Back in my country, in Mexico, you have Haitian towns now in Tijuana, who traditionally people wouldn't be that familiar with having Haitians in their lives. And how we can solve that? Of course, it's complicated, because if the online debate, and I always say the online debate, because political campaigns now are being run essentially through the social networks, you have to fight some issues that at least I don't have an answer, like the echo chambers and political fanatism on the networks, on the social networks. When you talk to people and you try to make an analysis, let's say a rational analysis about what's going on, and as you said, for example, all the accomplishments of governments in terms of health, in terms of education, that doesn't go into the mainstream debate. The mainstream debate is more connected, I would call it like some sort of political fanatism, equal sometimes to religious fanatism, in which, as in soccer, if you are, in my case, I'm from Chivas in Mexico, the best team of the world. But if you are from Chivas, you would never, ever, ever support someone from America. You will never do that. If you have the same sort of line of thought in political debate, it becomes impossible to have a rational debate, because everything becomes more related to some sort of religious fanatism. And the other thing that I've been writing about this lately, and I work very closely with electoral institutions, is the strengthening of electoral institutions, the ones that we already have, who are in charge of running elections. You can imagine, for example, the case of Ecuador. For the electoral institution has been very complicated to go election after election after election. The same happens in so many other countries. So one of the things that we are doing through the OAS is working very closely with electoral institutions, trying to help them out to solve the problems. The best case, I think, is the case of the Dominican Republic, that we just had an election. Today is Wednesday? Last Sunday. What we did after the collapse of the municipal elections in the year 2020, we didn't have a municipal election, they were canceled, and we had to reorganize the system. We spent working with them almost 4 years. And finally, at the end of the day, we had an election that was recognized by all the political parties. President Abinader was reelected because people thought that he got almost 60% of the votes. But working closely with electoral institutions, I think is something that we should do. And one final thought on meaningful debate. Is it possible to have a meaningful debate nowadays? I've been involved in politics almost all my life, and let me tell you that you would think that through the social networks it would be easier to have a meaningful debate because you have more access to information. The reality is that you're not having a meaningful debate. And if you analyze new problems, I say new just to say a word, you have the drought, you have the lack of water, you have the shortcuts of electricity. I'm not talking about philosophical problems. I'm talking day-to-day problems that people are facing. When you see what's going on in presidential campaigns, you don't see this meaningful debate that is more relatable to everyday life people. And the other thing that also should be considered in one of the causes of the sources of discontent is how political party systems are collapsing everywhere. So the way we used to know political parties, it was easy. You would go to Chivas, you would go to America, you would be okay. Nowadays, you have so many political parties in some elections, and that was the case of Guatemala, for example. In the first round, we carry out a quick count every election. When they showed me the results about Arevalo, I said, who is Arevalo? Because we didn't, the polls didn't have been considered. But of course, because of his relation to the Semilla movement and all the work that he had done along the years, it was clear that people were looking for an alternative like that. But the old traditional political party system, I think, is collapsing. And in order to, I always like to be a bit more positive, because sometimes my analysis is a bit, frightening. It's in the sense of how you incorporate young people into this debate. Because we have done a lot, we keep working, we keep trying, but what's going to happen to my children and to my grandchildren? Is there a way that the youth gets involved into these discussions? And I think that's something, and always that I come to this university in particular, because I know Notre Dame is very much involved in building up momentum for democracy strengthening. I think that we should work more with youngsters, with university students, with high school students, in order to put forward a very simple idea. Democracy is not a given. Democracy can disappear very, very quickly. And you can see all the examples that I have mentioned. Of course, the case of Venezuela perhaps is the most painful one, but also the Nicaraguan one.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to give you an exercise. I want you to go back in time and think what expectations did you have regarding the goals that Latin American democracies could achieve after the third wave of democratization. Okay, what were you thinking at that time about this, and which expectations that you had were fulfilled and which ones were not?
Well, one expectation that any sane person would have had at the beginning of the third wave of democratization would have been that it would not have lasted, right? I was talking with Kurt Wayland over after breakfast about an article I published 25 years ago. It was called The Surprising Resilience of Democracy in Latin America, or something like that. And, here we are 25 years later, and most of these regimes have still survived, with, again, the exceptions, the notable and tragic exceptions of Nicaragua and Venezuela, and El Salvador. Wendy is certainly right to include it. That's right. No one expected that this wave of democratization would be as durable as it has in most countries. And if you add to that, right, some very prominent social scientists wrote at the beginning of the third wave that the durability of democracy would hinge critically on economic performance. Well, no. No, that expectation, if you look, for example, Argentina has had more than 3 declines of 15% of GDP since redemocratization in 1983. It was, 3 of the 5 steepest declines under democracy of GDP. By Cepal's estimate, it hit an inflation rate of 4,900% one year. It's experienced steep rises in poverty and unemployment on a couple of occasions. So, this defies not only what were commonplace expectations about Latin America, but also common expectations in the social science literature. I think that there's been, again, to a degree that's impressive, a lot of political incorporation and a lot of social incorporation. Wendy referred to the social incorporation. It's still in a context of very high inequalities, it's true. And one thing I would add to Wendy's comment, I agree overwhelmingly with what she said, but in some countries, including certainly Brazil, the tax rate, considering how the expenditure on social policies, the results are pretty meager. Healthcare has improved dramatically. Education has expanded. Access to education has expanded dramatically, but the quality of education, of public school education in most of the region is very, very poor. Augusto could, he knows more about this than just about anybody in the world, so he could speak for 4 hours on it. But anyhow, I mean, so those are some of the great positives that I think nobody would have anticipated to this degree. On the other hand, if you had told me that, let's take the case of Mexico. In the year 2000, when there was a transition to democracy in Mexico, right, if you had told me, well, I mean, this is a pretty wealthy country, right? It's a country that has let's say, the structural conditions to have enabled democratic deepening. And yet Mexico's democratization never deepened. And over the last decade, again, in part because of criminal organizations and in part because of a populist president, it has actually eroded over the last decade. I mean, those are just some of my thoughts. I think if we were just talking about the last dozen years, that it's true the region has been buffeted by both the end of the commodity boom and the pandemic, but this is not exactly what your question was, but I think over the last dozen years, the region in many, many respects has underperformed relative to what one might have expected 12 years ago, and certainly relative to what one might have hoped for.
Wendy?
Okay, the good thing about going first is you get to take all the obvious points. and then we're like left with, okay, what else do I say?
That's why they had me go first, right?
I'm the lucky one, fortunately.
Yes.
I'm the lucky one.
Just following the order.
Yeah, yes, I know. One thing we could not have foreseen was Twitter and X. And all this online campaigning on it. Okay, so you can campaign on Twitter or X. You can't govern on it. You need institutions to govern. And what we have seen is people being able to win on Twitter, and then how do they get their sort of diffuse mass support to help them get through hard economic, social, and political times. We just could not have foreseen that. And with Twitter and social media comes the importance of evangelical networks, which are really important in many countries, and you can reach them with one click of a button, millions of people. And so we've seen that being an important new element that I don't think anybody foresaw. The rise not only of evangelical people, but the rise of being able to tap into their networks. All the big pastors of mega churches are inserted in these networks, and so politicians tap into them, and there you go, several million votes. That was unforeseeable. The other thing that we might contemplate that has been raised in some form is that youth are supporting right-wing populists in Latin America. Male youth supported Javier Milei. Bolsonaro got a bunch of upper middle class guys who are engineers with USP degrees to go out and buy guns and shoot at the shooting range. This is a change. I mean, youth are supposed to be leftists. These youth are not. So that's really a change in Latin America. Not all, but this is a phenomena I think is worth contemplating.
I'm the last one, so.
Sorry.
No, that's fine, because you helped me out in my analysis. The expectations. I think that all of us expected good government, strong institutions, and wealth distribution. The reflection goes, do we have better government? Do we have stronger institutions? Do we have a continent that is not that unequal? The answer is no. The reality is that, at least from my personal experience, I could say that fortunately, elections are still happening. Because in many countries, the risk of not having elections was there all the time, particularly during the pandemic. During the pandemic, we listen to so many discussions about, well, I don't know if it's a good idea to have an election now. No, we have to have an election. Because if you stop the electoral cycle, you destroy the whole situation. How are we now? The thing is that economic elites, inequalities, and of course, the elephant in the room, I'm going to just mention it, the drug cartels and organized crime. And when I go to organized crime and drug cartel, I'm going to refer to Haiti. Don't worry, I won't go deeper than that. But in the case of Haiti, for example, the collapse of the whole system is led by a gang member leader, Barbecue, who just said, I don't take it anymore. I want to be part of the government. And that's a discussion that we should have. What are we going to do with drug cartels and organized crime? Now, in our electoral observation missions 5 years ago, we didn't bother that much with security issues for our observers. That situation is changing. Now, when we have to deploy large numbers of observers into specific countries, we have to have more resources, use these special vests in some places, which is something that we didn't have in the past. And as Wendy was saying, the online debate and now the emergence of artificial intelligence, you could be amazed of all the things that you can do for cheating using artificial intelligence during the political campaigns. For example, a relic from the past. In almost all the electoral systems, from Wednesday, prior to the election, from Wednesday to Sunday, you would call that veda in Spanish, which means silence. Is it possible to have silence prior to the election? Of course it's impossible. You will have people impersonating politicians in the social network, and if you are part of this echo chamber and part of this fanatism that is growing and growing and growing, all these kind of tools are being used more and more and more, and that's something that creates a big problem. I would close with something that perhaps is not discussed as it should in many academic places, which is we have to look further into how electoral institutions are being attacked and how they want to be destroyed. Because the only thing that divides us from not having elections is where a government takes over an electoral institution. And if it takes over an electoral institution, the game is over. Because then you don't have a referee, a political referee, that can help out in the political debate, particularly with such a polarized society. So I think that that's something that particularly, perhaps because I come from being a member of an electoral institution, I've been working in elections in the last 30 years, it seems to me that perhaps we put too much emphasis on other issues, but electoral institutions are very important. And I think the academics should be more related to the work of electoral institutions because, believe me, guys, they need you in so many ways. The universities to get closer to electoral institutions, particularly to understand some phenomena that for them, being so oriented to logistics, electoral institutions are, everything is about logistics, how you create the electoral process. These guys are really facing tough times nowadays.
Okay, we've been talking for 54 minutes, but we started a little bit late, so it's now 10:02. I would like to transition for the questions that you probably have in the audience. So I will say Jennifer McCoy because she was the first one. Yeah, I forgot our policy at the Kellogg Institute, sorry. So Jake, and you work on some of the issues that we discussed, so are you going to ask about that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for plugging me. Well, since Luis yesterday set the precedent of self-plugging during these panels, I'll say that it was great to hear, Wendy, your discussion of these retired military and police candidates. And everybody should read the article I published this weekend on this exact question. Thank you. But my question is a little bit broader and a little bit maybe a little bit provocative, well, maybe pushing a little, challenging a little bit some of these ideas. But so a lot of these, so for example, these military candidates, religious figures entering politics, sort of the collapse of traditional political parties, these have all been kind of framed in the panel as either failures of democracy or threats to democracy. And my question is, are we expecting too much of democracy? Like, if the military and the church are such popular institutions in the region, and the candidates are following the rules, right, getting elected legitimately to represent their own interests, are these not just unexpected outcomes of democracy functioning as it was designed? And that, you know, these issues are, you know, outcomes we don't like and maybe are troubling for other reasons, but shouldn't necessarily be framed as failures of the practice of democracy. Thank you.
This is a very good question, and it's a fair question, and this is the way I would come at it. I would say that we can't, that in theory, no, there's nothing wrong with someone who has a military past and then becomes a politician. We had a president in this country with that profile. The problem, and this, ditto for the church, the problem with the types of candidates that have come out parading their military and their church credentials is they don't link themselves to political parties. They're coming out as individuals. And then they get in power, and then they get in trouble because there is no institutional party to catch their fall. And then they have to look, this is the story with Bolsonaro. He emphasized his military past, he emphasized his evangelical side, although he's not actually an evangelical. He won on this, and then he got in power, he didn't have a political party, and then what did he do? He needed an institution. What institution could he command? The military. So he relied on them excessively. He eventually lost, so there was a course correction. He lost at the polls, which although he did a terrible job, you would think he would have lost by more, but it needs to be said that for any incumbent president to lose, it's a huge deal. But then what did you get? You got the next government with a Supreme Court head who felt like he needed to rid the ranks of everyone he didn't like, and then you have Alexandre de Moraes overstepping his judicial role and getting rid of people on rules he invented yesterday, sidelining Bolsonaro on pretty questionable charges. And so there's nothing wrong with the profile of these candidates per se. It's that they are not running under institutional means. They don't have parties. And then you get this spiraling downward of them looking to other institutions and everything that brings on.
Sure. I mean, just very briefly, I completely agree that there's no problem in principle with retired military officers running for office and getting elected. The problem is that many of them have profoundly authoritarian profiles. So this was the case of Bolsonaro, it was the case of Hugo Chavez, right? And I mean, these have not been state builders or institution builders or anything close to it. They've been state destroyers and institution destroyers. So I guess that's my response. It's not the background, the military background per se, it's the authoritarianism, the anti-institutional instincts, and I completely agree with Wendy. It is problematic, right, that they come to power with no institutional support.
Jennifer McCoy, you were...
Can I comment? Yeah. Of course, I won't go into specific countries or candidates. I work for the OAS, impossible for me to do that. But I would like to say something. Everything goes nowadays. When I say everything goes, means if the candidate has some support and you can build it up through this, you have a candidate. The problem is what happens when the candidate becomes the president. Is he going to follow up on democratic principles, on rules, on the electoral institutions? Let's say the whole deal that we have built. Sometimes I feel, because you question, are we expecting too much? Yeah, I think we are expecting too much. And what we're getting is not enough. And it's not enough because it cannot be enough with the inequality that we have in the continent. Latin America is the most unequal region of the world. More than Africa, more than Asia. And you can see how political elites and economic elites are still reigning. Even if they are not running for office anymore, they find a way to carry out their businesses. So if everything goes, and with political campaigns who do not have any sort of reality in it, everything can happen. So every time I go to an election, I'm always like expecting whatever can happen. And it does. So it's difficult to predict nowadays, because in the old days we used to think that through the building up of principles, rules, conventions, the democratic charter, and so many other things, things will follow, and not necessarily. So that's something that I think we have to reflect more.
Jennifer?
Thanks. So just following up on that last comment that Francisco made, and generally the discussion on the panel, yeah, we've seen some improvement in social services, et cetera, some improvement in poverty, but overall the inequality still seems to me persistent, for decades, for centuries in Latin America, that we just, with maybe the exception of Bolivia, had a big improvement, but overall not. And I want to ask you all if you see that as the underlying problem with the crime, the corruption, the impunity that exists, that we still don't see elites willing to address the social hierarchies that are so stubborn in Latin America for the most part. And until we see that, I'm not sure we're going to be able to address these dire problems that you're talking about, particularly with security and the political implications that follow. So what will it take? You had electoral movements. You had Lula. Lula 1 made improvements, Lula 2 a little bit, but Petro and Boric have not been able to pursue their agendas. So even when the left finally does get in, they can't pursue it. So what will it take? Will this crime and security wave finally be the thing that convinces elites to address this, or their enclaves, as you've talked about, that safeguard them, will just continue?
Well, I mean, the data that I have seen indicate that inequality dropped pretty much in about half of the countries in the regions during the commodity boom. So my premise is different from yours. Even cases that are known to be cases of high inequality, for example, Chile. I mean, inequality dropped a lot in Chile in the first 15 years or so of this century. Of course, it continues to be a region marked by high inequalities, and I think I don't want to be dismissive of the idea that there's a link between inequality and criminal organizations, but I don't think it's a tight link either, right? Because as inequality was on the decline, criminal organizations were gaining in power, and the homicide rate in the region increased. So again, I do think that inequality continues to be one of the great problems and challenges for the region. But I don't think there's a super tight connection between inequality and crime.
Certainly, there was a drop in inequality it's plateaued.
Yeah.
And I agree with him that there isn't a tight link, but the World Bank has a lot of studies showing that the countries with high crime are also high inequality countries. South Africa and Brazil are typically compared in these. And the ideas have to do with sense of relative deprivation, very close side-by-side wealth and poverty. And so in a general sense, I think there's no question, if everyone is poor, there's not that much to get. You have these inequalities. It's also galling psychologically. The studies that look at crime and inequality look at the psychological mindset that goes into criminality when you're living next door to a palace. But the fallback, or the way that many elites deal with this, I know the polls of elites in Brazil recognize inequality as a problem for the country. The immediate fallback, though, is build the wall higher, get your kids out of the country, buy an armored personnel carrier because you can, hire someone to guard your house. It's a very immediate thing because it's just easier to make a private solution than to battle in the public sphere. And also, I think it's very deleterious to have people of different classes not sharing the same institutions. The more you have kids in completely bifurcated school systems, leisure is very bifurcated. Public parks now are the only where poor people go. It has a self-reinforcing cycle that is not good. But the answer hasn't been work on public security. The answer has tended to be make my private solutions.
And just to clarify, I mean also legal inequality, access to justice, all the impunity and the corruption that goes along with the social hierarchy.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add up, I think at the end of the day, the problem of perception, how people are perceiving the reality and how they are feeling. When I was in El Salvador, some of you remember that I was going to go to Salvador for the first round. I talked to many people in the streets, and I went to markets, and this is not very scientific in a way, but when you talk to people, they say, I don't care, I just want security. Yep. Just give it to me. And that explains 85%. We can go into the details, but the reality is that the popularity of some politicians is very much rooted on the insatisfaction that the electorate is feeling. And in the cases in which you see that a current government, the incumbent is being successful, is because the government chooses 2 or 3 things, very specific things, and it goes to that. The thing is that fighting on equality on structural terms? No, I don't think so. I think the situation remains more or less the same. There are some advancements and there are some good things that have happened in the past, of course. And through all the examples that Scott and Wendy have put forward, I always measure myself against how I felt when I was 10, 15, 20, how I feel now that I'm becoming 60. Am I better off or not? And that's something that people really ask themselves. When you talk about political migration or the political reasons of migration, it's not the same answer that you get in Central America and Mexico, in my country, that the answer that you get in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and now Haiti. The reasons are absolutely different. Because, for example, in Venezuela, because of the collapse of the system, people are really just willing to leave the country no matter what in order to try to get a second opportunity. So I would say that nowadays, politicians who are very skillful with political campaigns online, they know that with 2 or 3 products, orden y progreso, and then you're gone, you can continue.
Thank you. Andres, I saw you before.
Gracias and good morning. I wanted to praise Benjamin and the panelists for bringing and combining this analytical on the research and practitioner fronts. I wanted to bring back the issue of organized criminal groups and go perhaps beyond the Bukele effect. The case of Ecuador illustrates this problem very well. What happens when we are pre-Bukele or we don't have this sort of a very firm top-down approach to combating crime. And of course, this is a new problem for Ecuador, and I'm no expert in organized crime either. But the general attorney has been actively prosecuting several cases where there are concrete indictments against organized criminal groups. And she has accurately labeled this, one of the several cases, a metastasis case, which is an accurate analogy to illustrate sort of the pervasive way through which organized crime affects and interjects with multiple levels of government. I'll quickly illustrate three levels. One is that of a non-state governance, where these non-state actors enter where the state fails to provide services in order to either provide or compete or outright repress and intimidate the population. The other level, and where we see this more specifically, is at the local level. So when we talk about organized crime compromising judiciary, armed forces, the police, we also have to start including how they intimidate local mayors. In the past year in Ecuador, there's been 3 mayors, elected mayors assassinated, and 1 presidential mayor. So this is a new form of intimidation, where if you ask, city habitants, do you trust, do you believe in participation, would you vote in an election, they have to be mindful that they just killed their mayor. So that's a different layer of challenge. And finally, I raised the issue of campaign financing, because to what extent narcos and criminal organizations are able to enter the formal realm of politics by financing their way through elections. And this is really difficult, because then they start acting and becoming part of the formal policy-making process, both in the assembly or municipalities, from a formal stance, whether they are affiliated or not to a party or not. And in true Ecuadorian fashion, we tend to believe that there are multiple parties or multiple cartels fighting for influence with the president, which complicates the problem. So I just wanted to wrap up my comment in terms of how do we think about this challenge of restoring not just democracy, not just protecting, but ensuring also democratic governance, which is this connection more explicit between regime and state. And in the case of Ecuador, the term of the general attorney is coming to an end later this month, so in a few weeks, in a few days. And you already see the different political parties and groups fighting for who is going to succeed. But this, as we know, stands sort of as one important fighter and challenger of preserving the democratic order so far.
I can jump in if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think your comment is very precise about the metastasis. One of the things that we see in electoral observation is that the gangs and organized crime, they have a very specific goal when it goes to elections. They are not that interested in controlling necessarily the presidency. They're interested in controlling the police. And they're interested in controlling the municipal police. Why? Because all the businesses go through municipalities to small towns. And this is something that we have seen in many countries, the case of Colombia, the case of Mexico. Now in Ecuador, unfortunately, you have, in a way, imported all those, that situation. And I would like to say that one of the main problems that we're going through with organized crimes is that rules were already broken, and now in some places don't mean nothing, particularly in countries who are facing the threat of organized crime. As I said before, the case of Haiti is very dramatic, because there's no way that we can organize almost anything there till we get together some sort of sense of having a state that controls and rules the country, which is very complicated. And as you mentioned, something that it's been always something that we cannot advance in general, which is political campaign financing, where the money comes from. Because in general, in Latin American campaigning, cash is the king. And we know that cash doesn't come from, let's say, straightforward institutional business. It comes from the cartels. So when you see political assassinations, and we have seen that in Colombia, we have seen that, of course, in my country, in Mexico, with Colosio's assassination, and the case that we lived in Ecuador with Villavicencio, and everything that went after that, it seems to me that we have to think seriously about this metastasis, because this metastasis is killing, in some cases, the purpose of politics. So sometimes, and that happened to us in Guatemala, for example, it was very dramatic to see political campaigning in the border between Mexico and Guatemala. You would see 10, 15 Suburbans, these huge, like the beast kind of trucks, coming into a small town, and you say, why? What are they doing, these guys here? Of course, they are very much interested in controlling the border. Why? Because the business goes through the border. And that's something that we won't solve through a traditional approach of be nice, be gentle, follow the procedure, follow the principles. It doesn't work that way.
So just quickly tying together something Scott said, and then I want to showcase Guillermo Trejo's article. I think Ecuador probably can't do it alone. You need international protection for a major push like this, and that's the Guatemalan example. Yep. Tying your comment together that the international, strong international power is really important here, which leads me to throw out an ironic point. We're basically asking the U.S. to intervene in these situations. And did we think we would be doing that?
In the 80s, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
You want to say something?
No,
No?
I don't need to.
Okay.
I'm happy to, but I don't need to.
Okay. I'm making a list. So in my list, Abby was there, and now there are more people. So Abby. Brief, everyone.
Hi, thank you.
have
Thank
many
you so
people.
much for the wonderful panel. It's great to see you. Yeah, I was thinking about the role of social movements. So in the past, in Latin America, peaceful demonstrations resisting authoritarianism and trying to preserve democracy or transition to democracy. I mean, that mobilization has been key, and in case of Brazil, I guess, even more clearly. And so thinking forward in terms of what to do, right? And maybe putting aside for the moment the idea of, okay, are we actually calling for intervention, right? But thinking about how this can, movement of pro-democratic movement can come from organically from within. And so the issue I see based on your comments is that, and I don't know if this is a fair statement to make for all countries, but social movements and civil society organizations are facing this challenge of who wants to join, given that a very high percentage of the population are willing to trade human rights for security, right? And so I wanted to more like just know what you think about the role of citizens in general, but social movements in particular in peacefully resisting democratic backsliding. And if this is a different context as, when transitions to democracy happen in which citizens, organized or not, did have an important role to play. And so are we in a different scenario here, and are movements weakened or not, and what can we do about it to actually promote attitudinal change among the population. So particularly those that are not affected directly by the authoritarian policies reflect that protecting human rights is very important.
You want to go? You want to go?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's a hard one to answer. The capacity of citizens to mobilize on behalf of public security is limited, right? I think there have been instances in which social movements, or at least popular mobilization, was really important in saving democracy. The military rebellions in Argentina in the 80s and 1990 were such an instance. I think of NGOs as potentially playing a really important role here. And you know, some of the examples I have in mind are human rights NGOs, and also NGOs such as, I don't know a lot of examples across the region, but the Instituto Igarapé in Rio, right, which has worked on issues of violence and policing, or the Center for the Center for the Study of Violence at the University of Sao Paulo, which has worked very effectively with civil society organizations and in recent years with the police to think about democratic policing and how you improve public security. So I think there's a role for civil society, but without thinking more deeply about it, I think more about NGOs than about social movements.
You want Francisco to?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because we tend to, when we observe elections, we see that in some countries NGOs are powerful, or more powerful than in others. The problem is that in places in which we're seeing the disappearance of democracy, and I always refer to the triad, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. I used to travel to Venezuela and Nicaragua several times. Those regimes have disappeared NGOs, because being a member of an NGO is very dangerous. You can lose your life. So you mentioned attitudinal change, how to do it. I go back to the thing that I mentioned at the beginning. We have to work more with the youth. How do we do that? How do we encourage, let's say, a serious debate about what's happening in democracy in Latin America particularly? It has to happen in the universities. But it seems to me that sometimes in the universities, some other issues are more appealing than even the ones that we have in the region. I didn't see any movements defending democracy in Guatemala in American universities. Why? Perhaps it's not appealing. Perhaps we need to exercise a better way of defending democracy. But some other issues are more appealing. So I guess that in principle, we have to work more with the civil society and NGO. But I think that to work more with the strategy through this apparatus and youngsters is something that we have to do. To be honest with you, I don't have an answer. When I talk to young people, I feel the connection. I feel that they want to be part of the discussion, because they did not participate in building the institutions. They don't know what a dictadura means. Perhaps they don't know, they don't have a quick sense of what happened. And since they were given some sort of democratic environment, perhaps they don't think enough of what happens if democracy collapses. That's something that we have been working particularly with groups in Venezuela and Nicaragua, but it's very complicated. It's tough to do it.
I have in my list now Jim McAdams.
A quick observation and then a couple of questions, both based upon Wendy's remarks. The observation is we have fake Christians all over the place in these states, not just Bolsonaro, but Putin and Orban and Le Pen and, of course, Donald Trump. But my questions, and they're for the whole panel, Wendy mentioned the left. And it seems to me we have, kind of two parallel stories here in terms of democratic regression. On the one hand, we have the rise of the radical right. On the other hand, we have the failure of the moderate democratic left. And, you know, wherever you look, in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the United States, what you see is a left that is in disarray, or moderate left that has totally run out of ideas, or, you know, a left that is kind of courting radical policies that don't appeal to the ordinary voter. So one, I'm wondering, is my generalization correct? And then two, where can I find hope about the left, including the United States?
So it's a bad time for the left because the commodity prices are down in most countries. So they can't do the redistribution that they would like to do. And the market model is just turned into consensus in many countries. So without money and without really being able to present themselves as an alternative, it's hard to know where to go with this. A student of ours, I will raise, is looking at the possibility of the left to ally with religious groups. And this has been done in Mexico with AMLO. So the deal is social protection combined with social conservatism. And it turns out there are a lot of people that meet those two sources of appeal. This is even the magic combination in a country like Hungary. Social protection with social conservatism. So I think that may be a kind of a competitive space for the left, but so far we've only really seen it in Mexico. And then in some lower level politicians are trying to combine that elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I don't view the moderate left. In my view, in several countries, the moderate left in Latin America was very, very successful. I would say, you know, Chile is probably the paramount. Chile and Uruguay are the paramount examples. These are countries that experience deep, deep declines in in poverty and some decline in inequality. I would add Brazil from 2003 to 2010, not quite as successful, I would say, but still, I mean, there was a book published by three scholars whose names are Valent, Madrid, and Hunter, published 2010, and it's an excellent book, and it really charts some of the impressive achievements of that moderate democratic left in Latin America at that time. So I don't think that was a failure. I think quite to the contrary, it was a really big success, but then the question has been, you know, how do you remain in power? I mean, there tends to be an exhaustion with governments, right? Especially the end of the commodity boom made, as Wendy, as all of us have said, you know, it made it harder to govern very effectively. It made it harder to continue expanding opportunities at the same rate, to continue diminishing inequality and poverty at the same rate. But I think that these were, you know, by world standards, very, very successful experiences.
If I can be a Debbie Downer for one more second.
No.
No, you know, corruption, we've talked about public insecurity, but corruption is the big thing that people are really sick of. And I'm sorry to say that the Workers' Party got itself involved in the single biggest corruption scandal in the history of Latin America, which did not help it. Even Michelle Bachelet, her legacy has been tainted by the corruption, maybe not of herself directly, but of her son. And so the left has not been immune from some of the same things that have hurt right-wing politicians.
Yeah, just a thought about the future of the left or the right or the center. Perhaps the question is, do we still have the traditional concept of right, center, and left? It seems to me that for so many voters, that doesn't mean anything now. So perhaps the meaning of how we used to portray these kind of categories, it has changed. And for one reason only. Oh, many reasons, but one very important reason. If you want to be part of a political campaign and you want to win, you talk to your wizards, you talk to your team, and you got to be controversial. You want to burn down the system. You want to destroy the system because you're going to offer 2 or 3 things. So that's not very much based as it should be in a specific project. So I guess that nowadays, I won't tell names, but if you review the press in the last 2 weeks, and you look for which politicians in Latin America are getting media attention, you're going to see that those who are getting attention are those who are sending anti-system messages, even if they are government, even if they're in government, which is, I guess that is something a bit rag-nerving, in the sense that you would think that when you become a government, immediately you're a statesman, and that doesn't happen. And if we keep expecting that, perhaps we're going to get something that won't happen. So sometimes for me, it's you get confused when you start thinking like this. But they should be responsible and they should be rational. Yeah, but the wizards tell you when you're in the political campaign or you're in the political debate, no, that doesn't sell. You have to do something else. And that's against all the principles and values that we used to have. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have it. I think we should have them. But sometimes reality is very striking in that sense.
I'm very sorry, but we don't have more time. I'm very sorry to everyone. I mean, I have many people who wanted to ask questions, but now we will have a coffee break, so we can continue talking there. So thank you so much.